Our story today is one of both shame and repentance. An Imperial Guard regiment with its hands so steeped in tradition that it has created an air of excellence and stubbornness that has lasted over 10,000 years. But what are the early origins of this famous regiment? Borrowing from the imagery of the Cossack and Streltsy movements of Russia prior to the rise of Peter the Great in 1682, the Vostroyan Firstborn have a very ornate and intricate appearance. Red coats adorned with brass and gold finery can be seen from the rank and file all the way up to the generals of this regiment. Finely crafted and wrought weaponry that is passed down from soldier to soldier belies the otherwise normal rustic look of other Imperial Guardsmen. We've discussed regiments that have recruiting processes that start as early as age 6, or outfits that are born on worlds so dangerous that becoming a guardsman is the natural progression of life. For the inhabitants of Vostroya, there is an entirely different set of rules that are applied to this heavily Slavic-influenced regiment. So join me today in this journey into the Segmentum Obscurus to discuss the history of the Vostroyan Firstborn. Like Acadia, Vostroya has its roots in a pre-Imperium age. After the Golden Age of technology had passed and during the unification wars on Earth, Mars had pushed into many of the distant regions of man's former Grand Empire. Establishing what would become Forge Worlds, Mars grew its own pocket empire. In the coming years, the Treaty of Mars ensured that the Forge Worlds would retain their autonomy to Mars, but pay tribute to the Imperium's growing military might throughout the Great Crusade. One of these planets was the distant Vostroya, located almost smack dab in the Segmentum Obscurus to the east of the Eye of Terror. While not large enough to become a full-fledged Forge World, Vostroya was known as what is called an industrial world. Typically these fall under Imperial jurisdiction, but due to the Vostroyans' original allegiance to Mars, they retained their Adeptus Mechanicus masters. This would go on to influence the heavy red color schemes that are prevalent throughout the Firstborn. The populace is ruled over by an oligarchy known as the Tektriarchy. This is comprised of Vostroyan nobles, Mechanicus elements, and eventually Imperial officials once the Treaty of Mars is signed. This is of course at the top end of the spectrum, with the Highborn directly below the ruling class, making up the wealthy top percent of the population. The grueling and rigid class system goes on to the lowest portions of the society, simply known as Lowborn. The Lowborn spend their lives throughout the many manufactories that dot the landscape of Vostroya, producing arms and ammunition for the Great Crusade and later Imperium. Being inducted into the Guard is often seen as a great boon for people from this position in society as they go to leave the grueling lifestyle of a factory worker behind. But what of Vostroya itself? We have talked about the planet-sized tropical Australia that is Catachan, the desolate wastes of Krieg, and the war world of the not-so-distant Cadia. Vostroya, on the other hand, is a bit of a different world. While not the same level of hostile as some of the aforementioned locations, Vostroya is a world marred with collapsed manufactoria and ruins across the landscape outside of each of the many factories and cities of the planet. Most Vostroyans never wander outside of the relative safety of these cities as the planet is covered in an inhospitable winter that makes surviving away from warmth an uphill struggle. As such, Vostroyans are trained in various less than ideal conditions, from collapsed urban settings to the wilderness of Vostroya itself. But with the onset of the Horus Heresy, the great shame that defines and gives the regiment its namesake came to pass. The Emperor of Mankind put the word out to all loyalist planets throughout the fledgling Imperium. Stall Horus at whatever the cost, or, barring that, dedicate whatever Imperial Guardsmen troops you could to the fortification and defense of Terra. These pleas were met by the Tektriarchy with the typical measure of calculation that you would expect from a planet ruled by both Vostroyans and Archmagi from the Mechanicum. The ultimate decision was that Vostroya would be of better use to the Imperium by continuing to produce arms and ammunition for the defense of Terra than throwing her workers into the fire of war only to die needlessly. With that, the Vostroyans decided to remain on their planet, producing and sending supplies to the Loyalists, but without the aid of any troops. This ultimately panned out to be a mistake. During the end of the Horus Heresy, the Administratum took tally of everything, and in their bookkeeping, the lack of troops from Vostroya was brought up. It's one thing to have the Imperium issue an edict or punishment against your planet for your transgressions against the Emperor, but it's an entirely different one when one of his sons come knocking on your door to bring his fiery retribution. Reboot Guilliman, the Primarch of the Ultramarines, swept upon the planet of Vostroya like an angry girlfriend who had just gone through her boyfriend's DMs. Now this is a bit of a personal conjecture here, so let's take a step back. In my mind, the reason that Vostroya was dealt a fair bit of leniency was twofold. One, their denial to send troops still led to supplying the Loyalist war effort, so they were, in essence, trying to do what they felt was best for the Imperium. Number two, Vostroya still mainly belongs to the Mechanicus, and after all the damage that had been done during the Horus Heresy by the Dark Mechanicum, I would assume that Guilliman did not want to further drive any wedges where unneeded. But back on track, or back to fact now. The ultimate decision that was agreed upon by Guilliman and the Tetrarchy was that Vostroya would go on to provide every firstborn son of the planet to the service of the Imperium through the military might of an army of Imperial Guardsmen. Many regiments were birthed and created in the coming years, but all would bear the title of Vostroyan Firstborn. And for 10,000 years, the Vostroyans vehemently applied themselves to their penance, providing regiment after regiment to the stars to act as the military might and representation of Vostroyan's dedication to the Emperor. No highborn, tetrarch, or lowborn was spared this tithe, and all provided their sons to the service of the Astra Militarum. This creates a very different recruitment process than we're used to. This is still an industrial world, unlike our other regiments we've talked about, so maintaining production is still tantamount to the Imperial tithe that the planet must conform to. Every new recruit to the Firstborn is trained throughout the frozen hellscape that is Vostroya outside of each manufactoria. Snow and ancient city ruins act as the primary training fields for the soon-to-be guardsmen. Survival tactics and urban warfare are two big specialties of the Firstborn, along with incredible marksmanship. The stubbornness that marks every citizen of the planet also percolates into the overall attitude of the Firstborn. Ever persistent and able to weather the seas of outrageous fortune, Vostroyans are known across the galaxy for their implacability. But this is different than what we've talked about with, say, the Catachans, who use their abnormally hard abs to overcome obstacles, or the Death Corps of Krieg, who know no better death than in the service of the Emperor. Nay, it's different for the Firstborn. After training is complete on the planet, the soldiers are immediately sent off-world to reinforce the already deployed regiments across the many battlefields of the Imperium. This is very uncharacteristic of other Imperial Guardsmen, who just typically create new regiments with each tithing or deployment. Vostroyans have had the same amount of regiments that they have had during their inception 10,000 years ago, if not more due to the necessity for increased conflicts throughout the galaxy. Because of this, you have new recruits fighting with hardened veterans, helping to further their training as well as steel the resolve of the replacements. Some soldiers even fighting alongside family members, which helps to increase the discipline of the unit as a whole. Additionally, each regiment can trace their lineage back to their original foundings, with soldiers serving distant relatives that have climbed through the ranks. When we look at important engagements like the Spinward Front, we see that the Cadians and Cadian Silixian regiments were placed alongside the Vostroyan Firstborn for the longest time in the conflict amongst the Halo Stars. The Cadians had the numbers, the Silixians had the proximity to their home sector, but the Vostroyans had the constant flow of reinforcements. This allowed for them to hold the line for long periods of time on planets such as Kulth, where there was a constant shifting of the line of battle. Now, for a force that is deployed across all corners of the galaxy, the Firstborn are still adorned in rather ornate attire despite their vast numbers. Since there is such a close bond to the Mechanicum, and also being on an industrial world, Vostroyans get access to a great deal of perks. One big standout is that augmentics are prevalent throughout the many regiments of the Firstborn, mainly in pursuit of enhanced optics. As mentioned earlier, Vostroyans are known for their marksmanship, rivaling that of the famous Mordian Iron Guard. Optic enhancements, or augmentics, would only help to improve that accuracy, especially in the ranks of the commissioned officers that need to fire pistols with one hand or have lost eyes due to continued years of service in the Emperor's name. Looking at the rest of the loadout of the Firstborn, we continue to see this heavy Martian influence. Ornate plasteel carapaces, breastplates that are fashioned on top of a heavy red coat, brass metalwork weaving its way over the fine intricacies that marks each and every Firstborn as a standout Baroque work of art. It's a very stark contrast to the minimalist approaches from the Deathcore, Cadians, or the shirtless Catachans, who believe the finest decoration their uniforms need is another bicep vein bulging out of something that isn't a bicep. This detail extends itself further up the ranks of the Vostroyans. Officers typically have modified lasguns with axes or even something similar to the Custodes weaponry, where the lasgun is fused into the haft of a bardiche. Modified sabers, known as shashka, are brandished by the ranking officials of the regiment, pointing towards the enemy and victory in the name of the Emperor and Vostroya. There is a long legacy of excellence that is reflected back in the finely wrought uniforms of every Vostroyan. They're a prideful people that venerate hard work and stoicism. Every Vostroyan male, firstborn or otherwise, has a large, bushy mustache, one that they maintain as a further outward manifestation of that adherence to excellence that is expected across not just the regiment, but the planet as a whole. Before we move into the similarities of the Vostroyans and their real-world influence, this actually plays into it, it's worth noting that the people of Vostroya, and thus the regiment, are deeply religious and follow the Imperial creed to the letter. Primarily the worship of the Grey Lady, Saint Natalia, the patron saint of Vostroya itself. Every soldier in the army carries a copy of Saint Natalia's text known as the Tritis Illati. Now, as we mentioned in the beginning of the video, Vostroyan Firstborn pull very heavily from the imagery we get of Cossack soldiers during the late 1700s and early 1800s, namely the uniforms that were popular amongst Europeans at the time of the Napoleonic Wars. The typical heavy wool and canvas uniforms that were worn by British, French, Spanish, Prussians, and even Russians throughout the era deeply influence what we have with the Vostroyans. Not to mention, of course, the helmets that each of the Firstborn wear have that same kind of Cossack feel. Further into the weaponry and the use of bardiche-like underbarrel attachments gives a certain nod to the streltsy that made up a huge part of the military as well as social class of Russia, well, namely Moscow, before the rise of Peter the Great in 1682. Looking at the standard uniforms of the Vostroyans, you can see a sort of synthesis of the comparatively ornate Cossack guard uniform and the simple fastenings and stitchings of the more plain streltsy coats. Russian military uniforms also go on to influence another famous regiment of Imperial Guardsmen, but talking about the Ushanka will be reserved for the Valhallan Ice Warriors when we get there. Now, most of the regiments we've talked about, and to segue a little bit, have some sort of outstanding individual that's worth going into, or at least in depth on. But I'd instead like to talk about two standout specific regiments. The 9th Vostroyan Firstborn, the Old Irascibles, and the 1054th Vostroyans, the Voidstrikes. The Old Irascibles have this blurb directly out of the 8th edition Astra Militarum book I'd like to read for you real quick, so let's dive into that. The Old Irascibles earned their name not through a single battle, but through many hundreds. The regiment served for 3.5 centuries during the 41st millennium, and this being made possible because the Firstborn are one of very few regiments that ship in reinforcements from their homeworld in order to stay at fighting strength. The 9th Vostroyan became one of the most veteran formations in Segmentum Obscurus, before finally meeting their match during the fall of Carrick Prime. The Old Irascibles held the city for 18 months against a splinter fleet of Hive Fleet Moloch, facing a Tyranid swarm that stretched from the base of the curtain walls to the distant horizon. The defenders knew that the freezing chill of winter would weaken the Xenos horde, and that the aliens must feed by taking the city before temperature fell too low. The Vostroyans were running desperately short of ammunition, and they knew they would not last that long. Realizing they were doomed, the Old Irascibles opened the city's gates, drawing the ravenous horde within. Only when the bulk of the Tyranid swarm had passed into the city did the 9th Vostroyan detonate its nucleonic stack, incinerating the Hive, its defenders, and an estimated 85% of the Tyranid swarm. With the coming of the winter, the few surviving Tyranids starved to death, and Splinter Fleet was entirely defeated. So again, from this little text here, you get an idea of, you know, how tenacious these guys are. They're willing to they're in it to win it, right? And at the same time, too, you get that notion of how they're constantly being resupplied with reinforcements to keep a regiment in fighting or full fighting strength. The 1054th, on the other hand, have a very different role. The old Irascibles is that typical sort of overt heroism in the face of overwhelming odds, but the 1054th's tale is one that pays homage to the tenacity of the Firstborn. The Administratum had requested a regiment to aid in void sieging. They selected the Vostroyan Firstborn to create such a regiment, as they had already established themselves as accomplished siege experts. The 1054th was deployed to help take back the fortified void station of a defunct system lord, Lord Corsair Lenx. The Vostroyans took to the task as they always do, swigging bottles of vodka at the walls of their ships as it traveled through the void. The engagement would find the men of the 1054th sorely tested, though. Unfamiliar with the fighting in zero gravity and wholly unequipped, the casualties on the Imperial side were massive, as the Vostroyans were cut down in droves, unable to adapt so quickly to the new environment. In addition to this, the officers of the 1054th had zero to no Void War experience, their expertise remaining on the ground-based conflicts. With surges of reinforcements, the Vostroyans continued their assault on the Void Station nonetheless, and with each step forward, the regiment gained more and more experience fighting in the Void until they became peerless masters of Void warfare. Renamed the Void Shrikes, the 1054th was able to retake the station, mastering the techniques of fighting in zero gravity and exacting a harsh punishment upon the traitors of the Imperial. Adapting to the needs of the engagement, the Void Shrikes developed improvements to their uniforms that further allowed them to excel in Void conflicts. Rebreathers are a permanent fixture for the uniforms of the 1054th, as well as flak armor that has the ability to momentarily seal, that the soldiers can pierce a bulkhead in a room that has been emptied to the void. A number of other modifications that have actually made it harder for standard supplies to become a regular occurrence for the 1054th. So, as thus, their supply quartermasters modify all incoming armaments before deploying them to the rest of their regiment, and it's actually kind of a notion that they have a very keen idea or sense or mastery, I guess, thus of supply logistics. But for thousands of years, the Void Shrikes have acted independently, with an honor roll and pedigree that is larger than most Space Marine chapters of some of the later foundings. They're on constant engagements across the Imperium to aid in breaking open hard-to-reach or breach void installments across the galaxy. As a result, they only receive their orders from a series of astropaths playing telephone and spin the bottle amongst astropathic towers that dot the Milky Way. Both of these regiments stand out, in my mind at least, as sterling examples of the tenacity that this regiment, the Vostroyan Firstborn, has, as well as their adaptability. They have already failed the Emperor once, they will not do it again, and no task is impossible for a Vostroyan Firstborn to overcome. And this is echoed well into the current era. As the Cicatrix Maledictum spreads across the galaxy, the Vostroyan Firstborn are still deployed in earnest wherever they are needed most. Although they are beset by terrors all around them, they are still deploying regiments and reinforcements to distress calls that occurred before the Astronomicon was blinded to them. Holding their own territories as well as reinforcing others, the Vostroyans range out across the limitless void, using ancient techniques or simply muscle memory from the astropaths to try and reach their destinations. For many, this has proved fatal or has set the fleets many light years off course. But, and to quote the final sentence of the 8th edition Codex on the Vostroyans, never again will they wait when the call to war has been sounded. And now we've come full circle. The Vostroyan Firstborns really stand out from their appearance amongst the other Imperial Guardsmen we've talked about, but their flair and flourish only adds to their already amazing track record. This is a regiment that is known across the galaxy for staying in the fight, maintaining the battle line, and shouting at the enemy in thick Russian accent. The Firstborn might not be the commandos of the Catachan or the crazed death-seeking zealots of the Death Corps, but they have a camaraderie that is built across the many thousands of years of service. A camaraderie that both defines and strengthens their ability to wage war in the Emperor's name. Masters of urban warfare, siegecraft, and marksmanship, the Vostroyan Firstborn will heed the call of the Emperor wherever they are needed, throughout the galaxy. Thank you so much for joining me for this video here today. Our next Imperial Guardsman unit will probably be the Talon Desert Raiders or the Mordian Iron Guard. I'm not really sure, but I'll decide in the week to come. Stay tuned for some fantasy lore on Lorelorn Forest coming around the corner, as well as that coveted Primarch video for Conrad Kurz. I'm just now finishing up the book. I know it's taking me way too long to read of a 185-page book, but still, it's been a month. But we're getting ready to have that up on the channel here pretty soon. We'll dive deep on the lore of the Night Haunter. But as always, guys, thanks so much for watching here today. Have a good one and take care.